My name is John Geib. I'm a master gardener. I've been a master gardener for about 7 years now. I did my actual training for master gardeners over in Midland, Texas. So it's a little bit of a drier place than here, believe it or not. You can get drier. Somebody from El Paso that's here knows that even worse than Midland. So we're here to talk about composting today. It's going to be a rather quick run through on a lot of information. So try and hold your questions at least one slide, because when I flip to the next slide, if your question isn't answered on the bullet points, just let me know and I'll stop there and go back if need be. I've done this enough. I seem to answer most everybody's questions on the next slide that pops up. So, and I think that's about it. Yeah, my assistant over there is going to be going around handing out some pamphlets and information, and also has a sign-up sheet. Please sign in if you could, please. So, what we're going to be going over today is composting. There's a science to it specifically, but there's also a little bit of an art to it, which we're going to learn about specifically for our area here in West Texas. Talk about different methods briefly. We're only going to talk about one method specifically to get some good in-depth detail, but a lot of the information can transfer to the other methods. We're going to talk about the formula that you need to actually make good compost, which actually really isn't that hard, and some general requirements to get your compost pile to work correctly. Things that you need to put into your compost pile, things that you need to take out of your compost pile. The specific method we're going to be doing is what's called the hot compost method. There's also cold composting, composting with worms also. So those are the other two methods we won't really talk about too much. Then we're going to talk about a little bit about what you can do with the compost that you do get, what we're going to be doing, things like compost tea and soil amending. And then we'll talk about the particulars of dealing with composting in West Texas in the desert. Because, yes, we are in a desert. This is a rainfall map. Abilene's right about here, right in the middle of the difference between the green and the brown. We get about 24 inches of rain annually here, which actually isn't too bad. You can actually grow a lot of stuff with that much rainfall. Midland was about 13 inches. So that's the difference of 150 miles can make for you. But it is a lot of the conditions that affect West Texas are the very dry conditions and very windy conditions, which really do affect how much your compost will work. One of the things we've run into, home composting literature is wrong most of the time. It's usually written by people that live on the east and west coast, which are a lot wetter. It's Northwest, Pacific Northwest seems to be a location for a lot of the writers, and then the East Coast. And a lot of this, they're getting 36, 48, 50 inches of rain a year, and that becomes a major issue for them getting too wet of a compost pile. With us, it's the other. We don't get enough moisture to actually keep the compost pile going. A lot of times these are not written by people that have any technical expertise. They're just people that can write books. One of the things I've found, Mother Earth News has a magazine. It comes out. They try and promote a lot of the very earth, environmentally friendly type stuff. They have a lot of books that they get written by people that are in that crowd. The problem is very few of them are actually scientifically trained, and so some of their information may not be quite as accurate as it should be. A lot of times these books also don't distinguish between what's the hot composting method, the cold composting method, and that sort of stuff. So you get some issues with whether it'll work or how it's working and all that. It gets a lot of confusion, especially about turning compost piles. That's the real big one. So, here's some of the controversial aisles. If you go to YouTube or discussion board or something talking about compost, you'll see drag out fights in the comments with a lot of these different issues. It's going to get hot. No, well, yes, no, maybe, depends. Do you have to add anything to the pile? And then, you have to do it this way or that way, otherwise it's not going to work. And the big one here at the bottom is that it can take a lot of effort, and that was actually one of the few ones that is actually true. Hot composting is a little bit more effort than cold, but it still does take a fair amount of effort because you are moving a lot of soil. It is a science-based project. I'm with Texas Master Gardeners. We are, run through and trained by Texas A&M AgriLife. So all of our stuff is science-based, and this is what we teach, is the science-based portion of it. The problem is a lot of people do it. You can see we've got, over a dozen people here that want to learn how to do it. Everybody's going to do it a little bit different. Okay, so because of that, there's a lot of interesting information that cuts out saying, oh, well, I did it this way and it worked, so this must be the right way. As long as you get close on the science, it works. Mother Nature, by its very nature, decides it wants to decompose things into soil over time. So as long as you get close, it's okay. So, if you do the science, that's what gets it started, and then you kind of tweak your art and get it set for your particular environment. It is experimental to a degree, so, I've had Midland and here are different. A lot drier there, still pretty dry here. If I was to move to Houston, it would be a whole different story. So I have to experiment where I'm at to learn exactly what will work. So you just got to kind of keep the science rules in mind while you're tweaking what you want to do for your local area. Our goal is to produce humus. Humus is it's a soil, but it's a very rich, organic, laced soil. It's very good stuff for your gardens. Some of the benefits of composting. You get to recycle all of your stuff, any of your yard waste, that sort of stuff on site. That prevents it from going to the landfill, which can be very costly for us in the long run. It recycles all of that material back into nutrients for the plants that are still alive and growing to grow even better. It's a very useful process. We do add a lot of organic material into the soil. This organic material helps hold moisture into the soil so that during our dry spell, especially like the last three or 4 months, it'll hold on to that what moisture it does have a lot better and allow the plants to thrive a lot. It is economical. If you price compost at the store, it gets rather pricey rather quickly, especially if you're doing large garden beds and doing a lot of compost into it. Also, long term, it does help us in our taxes, believe it or not, which I'll discuss here in a second. And it does give you a little bit of a mental satisfaction knowing that you've been able to produce this stuff that you could turn around and feed your plants with. And it is a very good exercise for you also. This is the latest information I could find on trash that's going to our landfills. If you notice on this, besides the leather, the plastics, the metal, and the glass, which is this much, all of the rest of that stuff is compostable. So 2/3 of the stuff we're throwing out can go in our compost pile. So just think about it. If we recycled all of that material, even if it's just at home composting bins, we can take our landfill that's designed for 50 or 80 years and now make it last 150 years. And landfills get expensive to rebuild. So the more we can not put in our landfill through recycling, a lot of it at home, the better for our pocketbooks long term. The humus, when it goes through, like I said, it adds a lot of organic material into the soil. This material can absorb moisture and hold on to it while it's dry, and kind of releases it slowly over time. It's got a lot of nutrients in it. Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting is while it's nutrients for the plants, mostly what it actually does is feed the beneficial microbes in the soil, which then in turn feed the plants. So it's kind of an interesting symbiosis in that process. And scientists are still a little funky on exactly who's feeding whom and where the nutrients are actually going. But the long-term process is you add the compost to the soil, the plants are getting fed, even if there's an intermediate step in there of going through some microorganisms or whatnot. It improves the quality of the soil. My particular place here, we have hard clay soil. My place back in Midland, we had sandy soil. Two extremes on, lousy conditions for your soil. You add compost to it, it all helps improve it, makes it nice and fluffy. That a nice good soil that actually the plant roots can grow through and be able to absorb all the nutrients that they need to grow really nicely. Now, what is composting though? We've been talking about it, but what is it? Well, it's nothing more than the intentional organization of material to help it break down faster. That's all it is. And around here, it's not too hard to do. One of the problems we run into, some of you remember your 7th and 8th grade biology classes when we're talking about plants' nutrient cycles and whatnot. Leaves drop off the tree, hit the ground, get pulled into underground, usually by the worms and other critters. Some of it's broken down on the surface by other insects, beetles, that sort of stuff. Pulled down into the soil through the moisture falling onto the soil and by the bugs bringing it in. Feeds the root cycle. Tree, the plants grow, produce more leaves fall off at the end of the season, cycle repeats. The only problem with this is that in West Texas, leaves drop down and then they blow away. So they don't have the chance to break down and get absorbed into the soil like they should. So one of the things, for those of you that are environmentally friendly, if you want to talk about carbon sequestration and that sort of stuff, this is one of the best methods of carbon sequestration because you're turning the carbon from all of the plants and whatnot into basically a insoluble type material where the carbon is latched into the soil for very long periods of time. So it's a very useful thing for that. When we're talking organic material, we're pretty much talking about anything that at one point in time was living within recent memory. Because I've had people go, oh, but oil used to be living plants. Yeah, no, too long ago. If it was pretty much a living creature in the last, 50, 100 years, it's fine to put into your compost pile. There are some minor things that we don't want to do that fall into that, but we'll get into that here in a little bit. And like I said, the problem we have here really is the wind blowing off all of our materials. In Midland, it was kind of funny because in February and March, New Mexico would come to visit, and then in April and May, it would go back to New Mexico. So it's like, we never had anything that would stick to the ground very long. So, and we've got the same problem here. I've actually noticed that Abilene's even windier than Midland. It's just more constant here as opposed to very, it's more of a higher slow level winds as opposed to Midland where it was very peaky type winds. So it's kind of interesting. All we're trying to do though is we're trying to organize it. So all we need to do is take all of the material, move it off to the side and keep it contained so it doesn't blow away so it can decompose. What we're looking to do is do what's called aerobic decomposition. All that means is that it's decomposition with oxygen. We don't want to get to the state of an anaerobic decomposition that's without oxygen. That's when you get the stinky smells like hydrogen sulfide. So that's something we try and avoid. It's still breaking down, but it's not quite as fast of a process, and it's also not as pleasant to be around. The finished compost, which you see the handfuls of right there, it's got a lot of various materials in it. Anything from the nutrients, microbes, bacteria, a lot of bacteria in it. Some of them alive, some of them dead. So it's just kind of an interesting mix of what we're going to get. One of the things to think about if you are going to do composting is a couple of precautions. The first key one that I would mention is a tetanus booster, or at least know when your last tetanus booster was. If you get poked, prodded, little cuts and stuff, like I said, we've got all this bacteria and stuff in the ground. A lot of that sometimes can be the bacteria that causes tetanus problems, and so you want to make sure that you're at least up to date so you don't have too big of a problem with it. A lot of times you're going to want to wear gloves. I've found out over the last couple of years I'm actually somewhat allergic to some of the bacteria that we get in compost. I'll be digging in my compost pile and I'll come in and my arms will be all red and eaten up with like an eczema. But it's like, well, I deal with compost all the time, so I just have to learn to live with it. But, it's not a whole lot. When you're turning your compost pile, because you are dealing with a lot of these bacteria, some molds and that sort of stuff, a lot of times you're going to want to sprinkle it down right ahead of time. Makes it heavier to turn, but it also doesn't put out nearly as much dust and dirt. So it's a much nicer environment to try and work in. If you have a mold allergy like myself, a mask is very useful at times. I don't particularly use one. I just kind of suffer through it. But, that is something to think about, especially if you're severely allergic to mold. If you have any Band-Aid or cuts and scabs, that sort of stuff, make sure they're covered well. And if you have any garden produce that you're growing in a garden bed that you've put a lot of compost on, especially if you've done what's called top dressing, any fruit or vegetable that have touched the compost or within a few inches of it, because especially if it's raining, it'll splash that up. You want to make sure you wash that vegetable before you actually eat it, because it does have all of that bacteria on it. So, I grow completely organically, so everybody's like, "Oh, you can eat straight out of your garden." I'm like, no. At least wash it off, get some of the bacteria away. Then I'll eat it straight out of the garden. When we're talking building our compost pile, it's usually a mix of what's called browns and greens. That's how they classify them. Browns are usually very high carbon items. Think woods, papers, that sort of a product, dried tree litter and dried grass, that sort of thing. When we're looking at greens are a much higher source of nitrogen. Most of those are the green things: green leaves, green grass, if you're going to be doing like grass clippings into it. The grass there are some items that are actually brown that are colored brown but actually fall under the nitrogen category, which we'll get into. Now the browns will sit there and are very hydrophobic, which means they repel water to some degree. Think about a piece of wood. You throw it in water and it floats for a very long time. So getting that to be moist is a little bit of an issue. One of the things I found that worked real well for that is if I've got a lot of like wood products, I'll actually put it in a wheelbarrow with some sort of a brick or something on top, then fill the wheelbarrow up with water and allow that and let it sit overnight to absorb some of that moisture to get it kind of moist. It's a little helpful. So when we're mixing the browns and greens, we're looking at about a 2-to-1 ratio, 2 parts brown to 1 part green by weight officially, which means you don't need nearly as much green as you think when you start getting into this, because green has a lot of moisture. A lot of the green stuff that you put in there a lot of times has moisture into it. So it actually is fairly heavy. But it's pretty easy to take care of. What you're looking to get for the science-based portion of it is a carbon and nitrogen ratio of about 30-to-1. That 30-to-1 gives you a good compost mixture where it will decompose very quickly, very rapidly, with minimal smells, and so it works real well. There's a website right there in your notes. That's actually the extension service for New Mexico, their composting site. They've got a Excel spreadsheet on there that you can get into and play around with. And it's kind of neat because they've got all sorts of different materials that you might want to put into your compost pile, and a whole list of sizes of things that you might want to put into it. Anything, and common things, trash bag full, bale for like a straw bale, wheelbarrows full, all the way down to pounds or, cubic feet. It's got all sorts of different measurements on how you want to do stuff. And so you take, I've got, 3 bags of leaves. So you go over to the the bags and the leaves, and you go, okay, I've got 3 of these, I've got some of this, and it allows you to mix up and get that 30-to-1 ratio. You don't have to do it that way. You just kind of, if you get it close, it'll work. And I'll show you some tips on how you can determine if you're close or not. The key thing on that one is if you've got some weird stuff you're throwing in, things like sawdust. Sawdust is a nice, good wood product, very high in carbon. Very, very high in carbon. You take like wood chips, they're 50 or 60 to 1 in carbon to nitrogen ratio. Sawdust is like 400 to 1. So it breaks down very quickly if you can get enough nitrogen into it. That's the problem. And it's things like that that make that spreadsheet very useful if you're going to be doing some oddball stuff into it. So when I'm talking about browns, what am I talking about? Dried plant material, leaves, tree branches, yard trimmings, that sort of stuff. Pine cones, pine needles. If you get a chance to go get like pecan shells or something, if you have pecans and shell those work real well in the browns. Paper. Best use of junk mail I have ever found. Take your junk mail, peel off the little plastic window label, run it through a shredder, and stick it in I get bags and bags, of big trash bags of shredded paper that I use in my compost pile.
So the ink isn't a problem?
Ink is not a problem. Most ink these days are soy-based, so it decomposes right along with everything. So.
And if you don't have a shredder, you can just kind of...
You can tear it up a little bit. The smaller the pieces are that you're throwing into your compost pile, the faster they'll break down. You're looking for surface area, and so every little tear gives an extra little bit of a surface area on it to help it break down that much faster. So, other browns, dryer lint and vacuum cleaner bag type stuff. Now, the one thing I'll warn you about on those, most of the dryer lint, when you think about it, everybody thinks, oh, it's cotton. Well, it's not 100% cotton. There's usually some sort of nylon or polyester blend into those materials. So unless you're doing 100% cotton, especially with like towels are the one thing you can usually do. That lint's going to have a little bit of plastic in it when you throw it into the compost pile. Now, it's microscopic and you're not really going to notice it, but it will be in your soil at some point. So just something to think about. Any of the natural textiles, cotton, wool, burlap, silk, those sorts of things work well. Untreated wood products. If you have treated wood products that have been treated for ground contact or that sort of stuff, you don't want to use those. That's got some really nasty chemicals in it that you don't want to put into your compost pile. Specifically copper and arsenic on a lot of these. So the wood chips, I know the city has a place where you can go get as much free wood chips as you want. Think about that. It works well for, as a base starter for your compost pile. The thing about that is a lot of that stuff, like pretty much any municipal place, it does get occasionally little bits of trash into it. Okay, so you may have to pull a few pieces out, but it's still free. So it adds a lot of stuff, a lot of good stuff to your compost pile. And whatever you don't use as actual compost, you can spread on the top as a mulch, which actually works pretty well. There are companies that will, tree trimming companies that will actually deliver to you sometimes. The one problem with those, they deliver a lot of wood chips at a time. I just had some. I live out in the country a little bit, so I can do this. I got 2 loads of free wood chips from them, so I could start my compost pile here. That's 80 cubic yards of wood chips that I started with. So I've got a lot of wood chips for my yard right now. And I'm going to be there for another couple of weeks moving it. So when we're talking the nitrogen addition to the compost pile, green growing plants, if you pull out weeds, that sort of stuff can go in there. Any of your leftover fruits and veggies that you've pulled off of your plants, some that have gone bad and whatnot, can go in there. Tea bags, that sort of stuff. When you're thinking about tea bags, this goes back to the tetanus thing. Most tea bags, if you get the store-bought tea bags, have that staple in them. That staple will will rust out and dissolve pretty quickly, actually, in a compost pile, because it's very thin material. But there is still a chance that if you're digging in there, you might actually poke yourself with a piece of metal and jab yourself pretty good. This is one of the reasons why that tetanus shot can be real helpful.
I have a question about weeds, and I understand the seeds not being there, but
Yeah.
I always just throw my weeds away because I didn't want them getting in my, I guess it's the nitrogen in the green leaves.
The nitrogen in the green leaves is what you're looking for. So it's great to throw them in there. The one thing you have to think about, some of the weeds will try and regrow, but if you get your compost pile hot enough, it kills them. So it doesn't matter. Even with the weed seeds and that sort of stuff, you can kill those if you can get your compost pile hot enough, which is about 140 degrees for about 2 days. It pretty much sterilizes everything in there. So it works that way, but things like, and one thing I do have a comment in here to warn people about, Bermuda grass. Both the seed heads on the Bermuda grass and the Bermuda grass itself, because Bermuda spreads by the rhizomes, which is kind of the thick roots that you'll see, you can't kill it. And once Bermuda gets into your compost pile, it's nearly impossible to get out. So I would, as master gardener, we recommend Bermuda grass as the lawn choice around here because it is so drought tolerant and very hardy. Those problems make it a very invasive pest in your compost pile. So that's one of the few things that I try not to put into my compost pile. Although I do try and I just usually throw it in with the chickens and let them munch on it. And then once they've processed it the first time, I'll throw it in the compost pile. So, any of you have fur babies? You sweep up, a couple of puppies of fur babies a week out of your house from the kittens and the dogs and everything, all that fur, that's a good source of nitrogen for your compost pile. If you were somebody that had a hair salon or something like that, you can use the hair into it. It is a good source of nitrogen. Yeah, I see you couldn't. Yeah, it's a little nasty for some people, but
there's chemicals in treated hair.
On some that would be, yeah. But if you do, if you don't have any dyes or anything in your hair, it wouldn't be a problem.
Okay, that with most women.
Well,
that's going to be a problem. Most everybody colors their hair.
Yeah.
Or a lot of people do.
Yeah.
I say women.
If any of you are into things like beer or wine making, the leftover mash and stuff and materials that you get from that can actually go into your compost pile as a very good source of nitrogen. Also adds some moisture to it, which isn't a bad thing. If you have any old stale cat or dog food, something like that can also go in. So, manures are very good for your compost pile. Depending, it's what we shoot for when we're talking about the compost is, putting the manures in is I can't remember the right, not carnivore, the other one, vegetable. Pardon? Yeah, well, either omnivore or herbivore, mainly herbivore compost is manure that we're looking for. I do say omnivore because chicken manure is a wonderful source, but they aren't eating meat. Well, they're not eating normal meat. They're eating insects and stuff like that. Blood meal, if you have blood meal, that can be a source of nitrogen if you're needing some nitrogen sources. Alfalfa pellets and stuff like that, especially if you've got some that have gotten wet and moldy, just throw those in the compost pile as a nitrogen source. Fish meal and emulsion. Problem with fish meal and emulsion, while they have very high nitrogen content, they also stink. And that stink will actually draw some pests into your compost pile that you probably don't want. Now, there is some issues with the manures. A lot of, and this is mainly for horse manure, is the big problem. On horses, pretty much anything that goes into a horse comes straight back out with almost no processing. And that wouldn't be a problem except a lot of the hay that is fed to horses gets sprayed with broadleaf weed killer. And because that material has not been processed very well as it goes through the horse, that broadleaf weed killer is still in the manure. And that broadleaf weed killer stays active for as much as 3 years. So if you have a friend that has horses and they're like, yes, come get all the free horse manure you want, maybe. You can test it out by trying to throw some seeds into it and see if some broadleaf seeds will actually grow in the with a little bit of dirt in the manure. To give it at least a little sample to see, yeah, it might actually work. The other thing is if they are using any organic hay to feed their animals, there is no broadleaf weed killer that is certified organic. So if they have certified organic hay, there's no problems with the broadleaf weed killer. And so, there's a couple of the names of stuff that gets sprayed on them. And I'll refer you back over to the New Mexico Composters site because that actually has about a two or three pages worth of information concerning that stuff. So, all right. Any questions so far? Okay. Just want to make sure. Things that we don't want to put into our compost pile. For the most part, anything that is not an organic material, metals, plastics, that sort of stuff. The weeds with seeds, a lot of times, like I said, you can kill them off if you get your compost pile hot enough. The problem is making sure that it actually does get hot enough. If you do things like wood ash, it will increase the potassium levels, or the phosphorus levels in your compost pile, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but you don't want to do it too much because you don't want to add too much phosphorus into your soil. Things like meat, fish, and dairy, small amounts are okay, but remember, a lot of times with the meats and the dairies, they go rancid and stink long before they actually decompose. So that can bring, one, smells that aren't pleasant to be around, and two, it'll attract critters into your compost pile that you don't want. Anything from rats, raccoons, all sorts of fun things. So just something to think about. Oils are kind of the same way. They go rancid usually before they can decompose. And really from what I've seen, the oils usually don't actually decompose. They usually get eaten by bugs and critters, processed through, and then that gets actually decomposed more than anything else on the oils and stuff, from what I've noticed. Some of the non-organics, charcoal products, especially if you use like the matchlight type charcoals, that's, petroleum chemicals are put on there to make it light real nice and easy. So you don't really want to put that sort of stuff into your compost pile. Any of the sides, herbicides, fungicides, pesticides, that sort of stuff. Like I said, hot enough compost piles can break that down to a degree, but it's usually not a good thing. Things like the fungicides and that sort of stuff will actually kill off all the beneficial microbes in your compost pile and not let it get hot enough. So you got to be real careful with that. Dog, cat, pig manure, that sort of stuff. Those are the ones that are usually considered too close to humans in biology that we really don't. There's never, from what I know, there's never been a case of any diseases transmitted through it, but it's best not to take a chance. Now, if you want, you can do those, but make sure those don't go on anything that would have something you would eat. So if you have a real big rose garden or something that you want to fertilize and make nice and pretty, yeah, you could probably compost that stuff, but just be very careful when you're doing it to make sure that pile only goes in that area and make sure it doesn't ever get cross-contaminated. So
pig manure cannot be used?
Preferably not, no. It's close enough to humans that the biology's not a pleasant experience. So the other thing is colored and glossy paper and wax paper. It's not that there's a problem with the paper per se for going into the pile. The problem is because it's designed not to get wet, it has a real hard time absorbing enough moisture to actually break down. Now, if you're going to be doing a long-term compost pile, like for me, I bake big raised beds. A lot of times, a lot of my colored papers and stuff get scattered across the bottom of the bed before I build up the soil on top of it. because it's going to be at the bottom of the thing. It will decompose over a year, year and a half as it slowly absorbs moisture. But, it doesn't matter because it's at the bottom. It's taking up space as much as anything else. So, a lot of these variables are interdependent when we're talking about the actual science here. We're looking at trying to get a moisture content in our compost pile of about 50%. Now think about it, our usual humidity around here is about 20. So environment around here is just going to be trying to suck all of this moisture out, which is one of the problems we're going to have to deal with here shortly. As it says, temperature, if it's summertime, it's already a little warmer anyhow, so it doesn't have to heat up quite so much to get to the good points. Winter, it kind of slows down a little bit because it takes a little bit longer and a lot of that energy is used to just generally heat the pile back to normal temperatures. Let's see, anything else in here? Insects and worms can affect your compost pile on how fast things are going to go. Insects will be attracted to your compost pile, period. These will include cockroaches, centipedes, millipedes, beetles, the roly-polies, all these sorts of things. It's part of life. They're there to help you break down the material. But this also means you probably don't want to put this right up next to your house. You kind of want to put it off in the far corner of your house so that any critters that do come stay out there. Okay? Something to think about when you're placing your compost pile. What?
I like insects.
Well,
I know.
You're surrounded by them. Okay, now when we're talking about constructing our compost pile, we're going to try and build it up, usually in layers, just because it's a lot easier to. You usually keep your stuff separate in between the greens and the browns. And so what we'll start off with, we'll have our little compost bin, whatever we're going to make it out of, which I'll talk about in a minute. Usually what we'll do is we'll put what's called bulking material. Basically, this are twigs, sticks, that sort of stuff, kind of put down as like a little rat's nest type of a thing. Randomly, you're not placing them nice and neat. You're throwing them in a way to kind of keep them nice and crisscrossed, to add a lot of air voids down there to add some extra oxygen into your compost pile. Okay? Throw in a layer of either brown or greens, and then add a layer of the opposite and build up a couple of layers, usually 2 to 3 inches at a time, so that the mixing doesn't have to take too much. And then you just work your way up. Every foot or so, you're going to want to try and add another layer of this little bulking material to kind of add air pockets into your compost pile. Work your way all the way up to the top of the pile. Once you get up to the top of the pile, you're going to want to cover your compost pile. Now, this could be anything from a mulch, straw, piece of wood, just something to keep that top sealed off a little bit from the outside environment and also from critters. When we're talking about things decomposing, there are some flying insects that like it, like flies. So especially if you've got manure into your compost pile. So if you can keep it covered on the top, the flies don't usually come around too much. So they'll fly around it, but they can't get into it to lay their eggs and whatnot. So this picture, of course, bulking material. If you've got any pine trees around your house, pine cones are some of the best material I've found for bulking material. They naturally kind of have all those little air voids where the pine seeds used to be.
So they don't need to be broken?
Don't need to be broken down. Just toss them in there, and it gives a little air void so you don't have to turn it quite so much. So, choice of methods. Like I said, we've got a compost pile. It's all built up. We're looking at it, and we've got 2 methods: the hot and the cold method. Excuse me. Hot method, we're intentionally trying to create heat. That heat is caused by the microbes reproducing, breaking down all the carbohydrates and stuff in the compost material that we're working on. That heat, the hotter it is, the more they reproduce. The more they reproduce, the more of them there are to break down the when you're doing cold process, you're not worried about getting that heat there. You're just letting Mother Nature take its time and decompose it as however long it takes. Turns out that I used to do cold composting and never really realized what exactly it was. We used to live back in Maryland when I was growing up. We had a small forest across the street from us. So every year we rake up all the leaves in our yard, carry them across the street, throw them into a pile, and just leave them. If we needed dirt, we went back to the pile from the year before, or the year before that sometimes, and depending on how wet the year was, and dig dirt out of that pile because Mother Nature had turned that big pile of leaves, that was this big and yay big around, into this little teeny pile of dirt over the process of a year. We never turned it, never did anything with it. It was nice, it was easy, but it takes time. It took a year at least for that to break down, even in good conditions. So what we will be talking about is the hot compost method. It's the faster method to get everything done. We are trying to create heat. Let's see where we're talking about. Usually when we're talking about doing it in batches. So we build a compost pile all at one time. The cold method, you can kind of build slowly over time and add to it as needed. But like I said, it takes time for all of that to break down. So it may take, the last stuff you put in is still going to take a year to get out. So a lot of times. When we're talking about size, we're talking as a minimum of 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot, which is 1 cubic yard of soil. Just as a heads up, a cubic yard of compost weighs about 1,500 pounds. And this is why I have up here up to 5 by 5 by whatever. Once you're getting up to about a 5 by 5 by 5 block of compost, which is a very large block of compost, that's 5 cubic yards of compost almost. So that's 8,000 pounds of dirt. If you want to try and turn this, that's a lot of work to move that. Unless you have a tractor that you can use to turn that, I do not advise going that big. 3 by 3 is actually a fairly healthy workout, even if you're trying to do that much. So, and the thing about it is, you build it as a batch and then you turn it. Turning it is a little bit of an issue on when to do it exactly. Usually, most people will do it about every 7 to 14 days. They'll kind of let it go way beyond where they should because it's a lot of work and they don't want to put the effort into it. So it extends the length of time that you're going to be making that compost pile. There are videos online that talk about making 18-day compost. But I don't know anybody that has that much time on their hands because you build your compost pile, you'll actually measure the temperature on it, watch the temperature come up to 140, let it stay for a couple of days, and then you'll notice that it starts dropping off in temperature, drops down a little bit, you go out and turn it. And it turns out it's about every third day you're turning your compost pile. Does it work to get your compost done in a couple of weeks? Yeah, but that's a lot of work to do. So it's easier just to kind of let it go for a little bit longer and let it work out.
How do you turn it with all that bulking material in there?
Usually a pitchfork, to help break it up. And once you get that bulking material in there, once you turn it, it's not in layers anymore, so it's just kind of throughout. And it's a little bit of a pain, but it helps keep those air pockets in there because one of the things we're going to be talking about here in a minute, we don't want airflow going through the pile because of the humidity around here. It sucks all the moisture out of the pile. So we need to keep what air we have in there and the moisture in, and so we kind of seal off the outside edges. So.
If I turn my mulch over, do I need to go ahead and water every layer?
Yeah, you want to keep, when you do the bulking, like I said, we want to water it to start with to keep the dust layer off. But as we're mixing it in, we want to make sure that the compost pile has enough moisture, that 50% moisture ratio, all the way through. Now, what's 50% moisture ratio? Think wet coffee grounds. You grab it, you squeeze it, you're going to get moisture out of it, but it's not going to be dripping moisture out of it anymore. So it's nice and wet, but not dripping wet. So, as it heats up, it can get up to, I've seen temperature piles on my piles as high as 165 degrees. It can get quite hot inside of a well-built compost pile, especially if it's got a little bit too much nitrogen in it. Nitrogen makes it go a lot hotter, a lot faster. But the problem is, a lot of times, if you got too much nitrogen, it actually stinks also. Think wet manure. That's the smells you kind of get off of too much nitrogen. So not a pleasant smell a lot of times. So that's why you want to try and keep it down a little bit. Hot composting can take as long as 3 to 6 months. Like I said, depends on that turn time. If you're going a couple of weeks between each time, it's going to end up with a 6-month lead time on your compost pile. 3 months is not too hard to get though, and it's thoroughly composted. A lot of times you'll build them in a couple of bins. The main reason for that is so that you can you build your pile, and when you go to turn it, what you do is you just turn your pile from one bin to the other. That makes everything gets kind of turned and jumbled up and everything to re-energize everything, add more oxygen back into the pile. But it's easy to do it from one to the other as opposed to trying to return everything in the same compost bin. Like I said, at the end, a lot of times we'll do what's called a cold curing phase. It's more of a fungal phase, not just a bacterial phase. Adds a lot more, complexity into that web of life into the soil. Don't have to do it, but you can. And a lot of times your compost pile can decrease by as much as half in size by the time you're done with your compost pile. So, you start with, cubic yard, you end up with half a cubic yard. Still a fair amount of soil, but, something to think about. And a lot of that depends on how hot your pile's been getting. If it doesn't get really, really hot, it doesn't lose quite so much mass. But it takes longer to cook down. When you're looking at composting, this is commercial composting here on the right. There are regulations now concerning composting, thanks to a couple of things, including a small fire they had in San Antonio in a compost pile. They had a 300-foot long by 100-foot high compost pile that the guy was doing commercially for his own fields, because he had a whole bunch of fields out west of San Antonio, and it caught fire because it was just getting so much heat into it, and it took them months to put the fire out because they couldn't water it down because they were right on top of the Edwards Aquifer. All the water was going straight into the Edwards Aquifer. So it was leaching some nasty materials if they hadn't. But commercial composting, they'll usually do it in these big windrows. There are requirements on how long it has to stay at certain temperatures. Otherwise, they're not legally allowed to sell it. Now, the thing that they run into, or you'll run into, is they've met their requirements. The state considers it finished compost because it's hit 140 for 48 hours. You're good to go. They'll bag it, they'll throw it into a bag and sell it to you, but it's not finished compost yet. And so you'll get a bag of compost and it smells because it's still not finished composting. So if you go into the store and go to buy a bag of compost that smells, don't buy it. It's not finished. So
Will it finish in the bag?
it will finish in the bag eventually. But by that point in time, it's usually an anaerobic decomposition, which is why you're getting that smell. And so it doesn't have enough oxygen, so it's a lot of hydrogen sulfide gets put off by the compost as it finishes off. So if you want to take it home and finish it at the house, that's fine. It's just going to take, a couple of weeks to finish off. So you see the temperature thermometer in the middle there. Think of, a meat thermometer, except 3 feet long, or 2 feet long. You can buy these at any of the garden centers, and what you can do is, if you want to keep an eye on your temperatures for your compost pile, you take this probe in and stick it in and just see where the temperature range runs. They'll usually marked off with like a green range for the good, which is like 120 to 140, and then like a gray range if it's getting really hot. So it's something, just to kind of keep an eye on it, make sure it's not getting too hot. So when we're talking fragrances, like I've said a couple of times, if you aren't getting enough oxygen into your pile, you end up with anaerobic decomposition, which is where you get the smell. If you don't add enough bulking material a lot of times to get enough oxygen in there, the compost pile will compress and gets wet spots, and so it chokes off all the oxygen. That's one of the big problems with having a little bit too much moisture in your pile. So like that 50% is enough, but you can keep it even a little less than that works. It's just got to remember that if it doesn't have that moisture, it's not going to decompose. So, when we're talking setups, I'll just run through a couple of these rather quickly. The 2 to 3 bin setup, a lot of times you'll build your pile in the first one, a lot of times not even letting it get moist, just kind of building it up as you get material. Then you'll wet it down. But remember, like I said, a lot of that brown material is hydrophobic, so getting a compost pile that's built up dry is real hard to get wet unless you're getting it wet over time. Then once it gets done and you get it all wet and started, once it gets done, you can turn it over. Usually you'll flip between 2 bins back and forth, and then the third bin a lot of times is for storage of your compost while you start another pile. We're trying to manage airflow around here, especially in spring. We'll get 8% humidity and 30-mile-an-hour winds, and that will dry out your compost pile in about 3 hours. So if you don't have that moisture, nothing's going to decompose. So if we can prevent the airflow from blowing through the compost pile and especially drying off the edges, that's one of the big things we're going to be looking to do. So we kind of seal it off into a sealed box of sorts. Now, when we're talking about compost bins, we're looking at anything can be used for a compost bin pretty much, as long as it organizes it. Looking nice is a benefit, but as long as we can keep that airflow managed, that's the key things we're looking for here. You can buy some like these. The problem with these is they have lots of holes in them. They're designed for Houston, so they don't work real well. But duct tape works real well to cover up the holes. So you cover up all the holes, and some of these would actually work pretty well. This one is my compost pile back in Midland. As you can see, I've got a nice big tarp over the top of it to keep out the bugs, keep in the wind. The walls are actually made of cinder block. I've found cinder block works very well around here. It's a nice insulating material from the wind. It's cheap and it's easy to build with. Temperature on that one's running, about 140, so it's running pretty good. And then you can see some of the compost as it's starting to break down. Yeah, I didn't have that. Okay. There we go. So when my compost starts, it looks like this. A lot of that is shredded paper. And a lot of that I use is the stuff I pull out of my chicken coop, because it's got it's got wood chips in it, and it's got a lot of chicken manure in it. Now, the one thing about chicken manure is it's very high in nitrogen, so you have to really be careful with it. Once it starts decomposing, you can see that you can still see a little bit of stuff in there that looks like it's not decomposed. It's not soil. It's chunks of wood. It's a little bit of paper and whatnot. And then this is my finished compost. It's a little bit dry right now. And go ahead and smell this as it goes by. You can get that nice, good smell. Actually, it's got almost no smell because it's so dry right now. But, and that's what finished compost will look like. It's completely decomposed. There is nothing in there that looks like any of the stuff it started with. If you got straw bales, straw bales work well. Just have to remember, if you're going to use straw bales for a compost bin, they will decompose, at least on the inner edges, so you will have to replace them at some point in time.
Oh, so that's the walls.
Yeah, use it as the walls, just like this. Yeah. And like on the bottom picture there, they're actually built it just wide enough for the tractor to get in there to turn the compost piles. If you've got chickens, you can use them to do your work on it. So the one thing about this is you've got to, it will dry out the top of that pile. So you're going to want to have to try and, keep that covered somehow. So, this is a 3-bin box. This is what's called a New Zealand box. I'm assuming that's where it was originally designed at. What's nice about this is you see the corner posts have little slots in them, and then the boards that slide into those 2 slots. What's nice about this is when you go to turn the pile, you can pull the slats between the 2 piles and just kind of pull that one pile into the next box. And, half of your turning is already done just by a simple pull of the stuff. But it also allows you to open it up on the front so you can dig out all of the compost easily from the front. A couple more low porosity type bins. Notice we're trying to keep that airflow managed by solid walls. You can do it in something like this, which is just a little steel cage of wire. The one problem with these will dry out. Even on a non-windy day, these will dry out in about 3 or 4 hours around here. You can solve that problem by using plastic to line it. The one problem you'll find with this, the bags will decompose in the sunlight rather quickly. So I would suggest running a border of cardboard around it first to block the sun, then use the plastic to line it, and then build your compost pile inside. You can buy the big roller tumblers. These supposedly work. I've found one person in 6 years of teaching this class that actually has enjoyed their roller tumbler. Because
I've used something like this before. It seems like you're adding to it, and it takes so much longer to finish because you're continually adding to it.
Yeah.
Or you've got to have 2, or I don't
Yeah,
know.
and it gets really heavy. Even if it's well built on wheels, you're still dealing with up to 1,000 pounds of weight in that thing.
So you've got to have 2.
I
You really need to have
I think the idea is that you run it through as a cycle, empty it, and then refill it and run it again.
So you've got to completely fill it and then not add anything else to it.
Right.
And then you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. 2 pours with wires. If you want to go cheap, you can. Free pallets a lot of times. The only problem is it's got a lot of open space. So something as simple as cardboard slid down in between that would probably block most of the wind for you. So, do you need to add anything to this? No, not really. I mean, Mother Nature will decompose on its own. So you really don't have to add anything. This is one of those things that's been, you need to do it to start it. They sell them in garden centers, okay? Compost starter and stuff. Everything that you need to start your compost pile is already in the material that's sitting there that you put in your compost pile. So you really don't need to add anything to it. If you want to, you can, but like I said, you really don't need to. The one thing you don't want to do is add lime. Lime will add alkalinity to the soil. Around here, I think we're running, Jackie, about a 7.5 or 8 on average for most soils. Yeah, so I mean, we don't need to go any higher in alkalinity. We need to go the other direction. So, and compost turns out by the time you finish compost is a nice even 7, pretty much for a pH level. So it's right where we need it. So, it is a hot pile we're talking about. So we are looking at turning the pile to keep that high rate of reproduction going. We are trying to keep that heat, but we are trying to keep it contained inside some walls, which is why we need to have the solid walls to do it. And we do build them as a a unit to start off the process that was wanted, not trying to build it over time. When's it complete? Well, you saw what the compost pile. Anybody get any funky smells off of that third jar? Remember that thing I've mentioned of things you shouldn't add to your compost pile? That was out of my compost pile a couple years ago when we harvested some chickens. Took my big compost pile, which you saw, it's 5 foot by, probably about 8 foot long and a couple of feet deep. All the leftovers from the chickens, from their processing, all the guts, feathers, all that sort of stuff, pulled back a couple of feet of my compost pile, poured all of that into there, threw in a bunch of shredded paper on top of it to kind of soak up some of the moisture, reburied it, and 3 weeks later you couldn't find anything that looked like a chicken. It had completely... So meats can be done if done right, but you have to bury them deep, and you have to understand that you may end up with critters if it's not done right. But that compost is partially decomposed, or is completely decomposed chicken parts. But you can't tell. It just smells just like normal compost. So if composting done right is kind of a neat thing. So, okay, that earthy fragrance, there is a little bit of a smell to that, but it's very little. It smells like earth. It's that good earth smell. That's the key thing. And you also don't want to see anything that looks recognizable from whatever you put into it to start with, whether it be shredded paper or, piece parts. So, when you get done with your compost, a lot of times you're going to want to screen it off because the whole pile will not look like that usually. It'll look like a mix between the second and third jars. Some big chunks and a lot of the normal stuff. A lot of times that bulking material will not decompose nearly as fast, and so you'll have kind of chunks in there from that especially. So if you use things like milk crates and stuff, work real good to get that bulking material out because it picks up the big chunks. For the smaller stuff, I'll usually use the 1/4-inch hardware cloth. Just build a little frame over it and pour your compost over that. All the small stuff falls through. All the big stuff, I throw right back into the compost pile to finish decomposing.
Do I have to do that if you don't want to compost?
It's better. You get a finer grain on completion for your compost. What can you do with it? Well, usually what we're doing is we're trying to amend the soil. Now, this can either be done by mixing it into the soil or doing something so simple as what's called top dressing. Compost plugs. And then the other thing a lot of people do is compost tea. You take a mixture of your compost and some water and steep out a lot of the goodness that's in the compost so you can feed it to your plants, especially like indoor plants. If you're amending your garden soil, you're going to want to usually turn it in a little bit, just a couple inches into the top of the soil. Okay, once you get done with that, though, you are going to want to cover it usually with a mulch or a straw, something to help keep that moisture in on the soil, which is recommended anyhow by the master gardeners anyhow to allow your plants to not have to be watered quite so much.
Any season?
Doesn't matter. You can just, any season you need. When your compost is done. Depends on if you want to do it in the fall or the winter, it gives it a little bit of time to incorporate into the soil over the winter before you do any spring plantings. But a lot of times I'll just throw stuff in right before I plant in the spring. It's not that, I've never had issues with it. So, unless your compost is not finished when it's still hot, because it'll suck out some of the nitrogen out of your soil. As long as it's finished compost, there's no problems. So when you amend your soil, water it in and then just kind of mulch on top of it. If you're doing a tree or a shrub planting, this is one of the things that most people misabuse their poor trees. They'll dig a hole, because everybody's told you dig a hole, you amend your soil, plant your tree into it. No, because you've created an area right around that tree that is really good, wonderful soil. It loves that soil. It loves the soil so much, the roots will never leave that soil. That's the problem. So it works much better if you top dress on do top dressing, you dig your hole, you plant your plant, you fill it back in with the native soil, and then add top dressing on top of that, and that will slowly over time work itself into the soil with the worms and rainfall and that sort of stuff. And that way, because the soil's native soil, the tree roots and whatnot will extend out like they need to. And it avoids the girdled roots that you see down at the bottom, which I've seen many trees like that. Yeah. You can do what's called compost plugs, especially for full-grown trees. This is one way to help feed them. Go out to the drip line of the tree, which is where you should be watering your tree anyhow, and feeding your tree is always at the drip line. It's kind of what the drip line's for. It takes all the water off of the tree and drops it into that line where all the little roots are that the tree really is trying to suck up all the moisture and stuff. But you'll dig a hole right there, foot and a half down, fill it with compost, cover it back up, and now that spot is a good energy source for your tree. So, compost tea, you can do a couple of ways of doing it. Usually you'll take your compost, put it into a bag of some sort, cloth bag where you can get moisture going in and out, and then just let it sit in like a 5-gallon bucket and soak, get that water to be very rich with all the organic material that's coming off of your compost. If you really want to supercharge it, they say actually throw an air bubbler, like from a fish tank. You can get the little stones with the air bubblers. Throw that in there. It gets this nice frothy, nasty-looking stuff, but it really beefs up the bacterial compost or bacterial levels in the compost tea that the plants love. So, works real well. Yes.
About the previous.
Okay.
So we have a couple of pear trees that we planted recently,
Mm-hmm.
and all this crazy weather. So there's not, the drip line would be a very small
Yeah.
space, but this would be maybe something good to do for them.
For them, I'd just top dress. I'd put a couple inches of compost all the way around the tree right now because it is such a small area. And that'll help kind of let the tree get enough nutrient boost also to help grow nice and big.
It's got a lot of grass around it right now. Is that okay?
They compete for resources. That's the one thing. So once the pear tree has grown enough, it will shade out the grass and you'll start losing the grass underneath of it, hopefully. But if you can dig up the grass and pull it out, that would be better. If you dig up the grass and pull it out and then put 4 to 6 inches of mulch, for a couple of feet around the edge of the tree, that will help kill off the grass and keep it away from it. Just remember, don't put that mulch right up next to the tree trunk because tree volcanoes are bad. It keeps the moisture on that tree trunk and it rots the tree trunk. So, any other questions? Yeah. Okay. So, desert composting. We're trying to keep things moist when we don't have a whole lot of moisture out here. So, when we do it, we got to make sure we control the moisture in a well-built compost bin. Mix it up nicely with that brown to green ratio of about 2 to 1. Keep it nice and moist. Keep it covered so that we don't get any insects or critters going into it, and keep the moisture in. Use that bulking material in there to help kind of keep the air inside the thing between turnings. And then just sit there and use the compost for all the good stuff that we want to use it for. So, like I said, the smaller the pieces are that you throw into your compost, the better, the faster they break down. Adding the browns and greens. If you're going to turn your compost pile, make sure you sprinkle it first to kind of knock down that dust. Make sure you re-moisten it as you are turning it to make sure you've got that 50% moisture compost. And then, keep it nice and covered once you get done. Okay. For those of you wondering, the Big Country Master Gardeners, that's our website right there, which is on your page. We are also on Facebook, and Okay. Yeah, that'll be the end of this class. Next class is going to be in December, or in January. It's going to be on vegetables and how get started for the next year's planting season. I believe it's on the app. January 14th. Thank you. 10 o'clock. So probably up in the auditorium, I think you said.
I hope so.
So
Here at the library?
here at the library, yes. So, any more questions?
Thank you.
All right, no problem. Thank you.